Both the United States and the Soviet Union have shot down civilian airliners. Today we will tell you why these situations have occurred, and we will explain why Ukraine is also quite guilty of what happened on the flight MH17, shot down in 2014 by pro-Russian militias in the Donbass. As we told about a month ago in this video, the Chicago Convention was the first time that aeronautical laws were established for all countries and in which it was expressly prohibited to enter the airspace of another country without permission, shoot down civilian aircraft and similar points. In the end, although these things are prohibited, they have ended up happening anyway. When a commercial airliner is shot down, most of the time is because it has been mistaken for a military aircraft or even a missile. It will happen in a very tense situation between two countries, and in the face of uncertainty, they will decide to shoot down the civilian aircraft. To explain this, we will show you two cases. One in which an aircraft is shot down by the Soviet Union, and another one in which the United States shot down a civilian aircraft, for you to see that in these situations there are not good ones or bad ones. Reality is much more complex than what we are able to talk here in 20 minutes. For that reason, a lot of details are not covered in this video. First, we will comment on the Korean Airlines Flight 007 shot down by the Soviet Union on September 1st, 1983. A Boeing 747-200 was departing from New York to Seoul, making a stopover in Anchorage, Alaska. Everything went normally until landing in Anchorage and departing again. The aircraft departed northbound and was to make a maneuver to then head towards Seoul, but this maneuver was not performing correctly, and the plane began to deviate more and more with respect to the planned route. In the cockpit, no one noticed this small difference with respect to the original route, so they continue normally. And here is where comes the big coincidence. It just so happens that at the time there was an RC-135 aircraft, a US military aircraft, which has a similar size to the Boeing 747. It was flying around the Kamchatka Peninsula, entering and leaving the Soviet airspace to monitor the Soviet communications, but as the Korean Boeing 747 had deviated from its original route, it was heading towards the Kamchatka Peninsula without realizing it. Also, coincidentally, just as the RC-135 went out of radar range and just as the Boeing 747 came into radar contact, the Soviets thought that the commercial airliner was actually the military aircraft, only these times it appeared to be heading directly towards a nuclear submarine base, so it was assigned as a military target, and for that reason it was ordered to intercept it by 4 MiG-23 fighter aircraft. However, they ran out of fuel, reaching the 747 and then let it go because it had left radar range. However, the plane was now heading south to the island of Sakhalin, another Soviet territory, which coincidentally had a main base of Soviet Pacific Fleet, and therefore as soon as it was detected, two Sukhoi 15s went out and intercepted, and this time they managed to get behind the Boeing 747. But I remind you that this was at night, so they could not differentiate the 747 from an RC-135, and what they did was to shoot their guns as a warning to the side of the aircraft. But again, it so happened that the plane at the time of firing the bullets began a turn, and this made the pilots did not see the bullets, and the Soviet fighters took it as an evasive maneuver, so they decided to shoot it down with an infrared K-8 missile, which severely damaged the Boeing 747, ending the lives of the 269 people on board. Actually, if we go to the actions to be taken in case of an enemy incursion into airspace, the Soviet Union said the following: 1. Cannot open fire on an intruder aircraft, fighters must force it to land, but it also says fighters must use warning fire first. In case of ignoring it, they will proceed to shoot it down, and that is exactly what happened. At first, the Soviets acted as if nothing had happened, until they saw that it was impossible to hide it, and back down. This conflict did not escalate, even though it occurred at a very tense moment of the Cold War, because it was understood that it was a big mistake. As in all accidents, something was improved, and in this case, a point was added to the ICAO rule that prohibits the use of missiles in civil aircraft interception processes and requires the prior establishment of communications, either by radio or signals, and a standard for these signals was created. The second case that we will bring to this video is the Iran Air Flight 655, shot down by the United States on July 3, 1988, in the Strait of Hormuz, ending the lives of 290 people. This flight originally covered the route Tehran-Dubai, making a stopover in Bandar Abbas, Iranian city located in the Strait of Hormuz. To put it into context, Iran and the United States were allies in the 70s, but at the end of this decade, with the 1979 Iranian Revolution, there was a change of regime and ideology, ending relations with the United States, and since then they became enemies. For this reason, despite not being allies today, Iran still has United States F-14s as fighter bombers, because they were delivered in 1976 when they were still allies. The problem begins with the geography of the Strait of Hormuz. Any ship that wants to leave the Persian Gulf must pass through this strait, and at the time there was a war going on between Iraq and Iran, and the tension in the Gulf was very high. It must be taken into account that 20% of the world's oil has to cross this strait, and given the frequent hostilities by Iran towards tankers coming from Kuwait with oil, the United States escorted some of these tankers that had to cross the strait. Only 1 year before, missiles were fired at one of the United States frigates, and that killed several sailors, so the United States officials warned that commercial aircraft flying over the area should carry 2 radio frequencies, one civilian and one military, in case any United States warship asked to identify them. Well, as you may remember from the previous video, we commented that each country has sovereignty from its 12 nautical miles from its coastal waters. Well, on the day of the incident, the United States had its ships in Iranian territorial waters, because on that day, the USS Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser, was returning from an escort mission when a US helicopter reported gunfire from an Iranian small boat, and so the Vincennes went towards that course to engage them. At the same time, the Iran Air Flight 655, an Airbus A300, was detected taking off by the Vincennes radar, but was mistakenly identified as an Iranian F-14 heading towards them. The Vincennes started sending warnings on the above-mentioned military radio frequency, but the Iranian aircraft was not monitoring it. Up to a total of 7 warnings were reported on this military frequency, and in the end it was decided to send 3 more warnings on a civil frequency. But there was no response, as I remind you that from the Vincennes they thought it was an Iranian F-14, and that was how they called it by radio. Finally, the decision was taken to launch 2 anti-aircraft missiles, which ended up shooting down the plane, ending the lives of everyone on board. There are several things that make this situation more controversial. From the USS Vincennes, it was said that the F-14 was descending towards the ship, as if it was going to attack them. However, the A300 was ascending because it has just taken off. In addition, and here comes the complicated point, the Americans knew that the Iranians' F-14s no longer had air-to-surface missiles, and therefore theoretically could not fire against them. There was a small dispute about how to act knowing this information, but even so, from the Vincennes it was decided to shoot down the aircraft. It is also said that the Vincennes acted very aggressively in the first place, going on the offensive against the Iranian small boats, which did not offer much danger, and therefore entered Iranian territorial waters, and it is also not certain whether the American helicopter was actually shot at or whether it was a mistake by the crew of the helicopter. The Pentagon said at first that they had shot down an F-14, but hours later they corrected the version and justified themselves by explaining that the Bandar Abbas airport was also used as a military base for F-14s, apart from the fact that the aircraft did not identify itself. But of course, it did not, because it was not equipped with systems to use military frequencies, and in the messages on the civilian frequency it was not clear which aircraft was being asked for identification. On the other hand, Iran said that the United States did it on purpose, even knowing that it was a commercial aircraft being shot down, and they also said that even if it was an F-14, they had no right to shoot it down because they were on Iranian territorial waters. Thanks to recordings of what happened from the bridge of the USS Vincennes, it can be seen how the US sailors really believed that they were being attacked by an Iranian aircraft. As you can see, a lot of chaos took place in this incident, but I repeat myself again, I do not believe that any government will shoot down a commercial aircraft on purpose, because that has no positive effect and brings a lot of problems. However, there have been occasions in history where a civilian aircraft has been shot down or tried to do so, with no other objective than to do harm. But these type of attacks are not usually perpetrated by an official army, but by militias attached to a conflict. As for example in Baghdad, capital of Iraq, on November 22, 2003, when a group of Fedayeen, a paramilitary organization loyal to Saddam Hussein's government, tried to shoot down a DHL Airbus A300 by using a Strela missile, a Soviet manpad of which we talked about it in the previous video. At that time, the invasion of Iraq was taking place, and to reduce exposure to this type of attack, all aircraft, including civilian transports such as the one of the accident, must climb very aggressively on takeoff and with a random flight path, so that an attack could not be planned in advance. But in this case, it was not enough to avoid the missiles impacting them. The missile severely damaged the left wing, generating a total loss of hydraulic power and also a loss of fuel. By taking the aircraft hydraulic systems down, the pilots had to fly only with the engines, giving more or less power to each one to achieve a turn, and giving or removing power in a symmetrical way to climb or descend, just like the United Airlines 232 flight that we already discussed in detail in this video. They finally managed to land the aircraft flying that way, which is something completely unbelievable. They made an emergency landing, having a runway excursion at the end of it, but the 3 crew members of the flight managed to walk away of the aircraft by their own means. But look how the aircraft ended. Something similar happened in Ukraine, but with a far worse outcome, in the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 in July of 2014, in which 298 people lost their lives, where 80 of them were minors. This accident is the shooting down of a civilian aircraft in which more people have lost their lives. To try to understand this situation, we must remember that this happened in eastern Ukraine in the Donetsk region, where in 2014 a war conflict was starting between Ukrainians and pro-Russian separatists, a conflict that in 2022 has ended up transforming into the current war that we all know. In March 2014, some airlines stopped flying over eastern Ukraine for fear of the conflict, because several military aircraft were shot down since the beginning of it, but mainly the shutdowns were due to the use of manpads, and there was no information that in the area there were any air defense systems with greater capabilities. So some airlines decided to continue with their routes, because as we have already explained in the channel, modifying a route can be very harmful for an airline for purely economic issues. What was done at the international level was to make clear the altitudes at which it was necessary to fly over that area, being 26,000 feet and 32,000 feet, the minimum altitudes. On July 17, 2014, flight MH17, having departed from Amsterdam and heading towards Kuala Lumpur, was near the Ukraine-Russia border at an altitude of 33,000 feet. It had to divert to the north due to bad weather and flew over the Donbass, where it was hit by an anti-aircraft missile near the cockpit, generating an explosive depressurization and splitting the fuselage at the front and rear, throwing out the passengers and causing them to fall from a height of 10 kilometers to the ground. Yes, you understood correctly, the plane broke up in midair and the passengers fell individually to the ground. Having exploded in midair, the wreckage was scattered over a wide area, complicating recovery efforts, and the scene was so horrific that those who live in the area say they saw bodies and pieces of the plane raining from the sky. Analyzing the black boxes of the plane, it can be seen that it did not have any problem during the flight, until suddenly the recordings stopped. It can be said with total certainty, even though Russia has so far denied it, that the plane was hit by a 9K-37 Buk missile, a Soviet missile that pro-Russian separatists most likely had in their hands at the time of the crash. Russia claims that Ukraine also had this missile system and has even suggested that MH17 was shot down by a Ukrainian Sukhoi 25 with an air-to-air missile by mistake. Disclaimer: the plane in the picture is not a Sukhoi 25, it's a MiG-29, but that is the official picture that the Russians show, so it's unbelievable. It is known that the plane was hit by a missile for several reasons. The first of them is that seeing the remains found as parts of the cabin, it can be seen with total certainty that it was pierced by projectiles with high kinetic energy. In other words, the shrapnel from the explosion of the missile. Also found inside the bodies of the pilots and inside the cockpit were pieces of these projectiles, with the same shape and material as that of a Buk missile. The other important point that was found by analyzing the cockpit audio recorders was a sudden noise just before they stopped recording. Having 4 audio recorders in different positions inside the cockpit and this boom occurring at different times, one can assume the direction of the explosion with respect to the aircraft, and this direction indicates that the direction of the missile possibly came from positions under the control of the pro-Russian militia. Another point to mention is that Ukraine was criticized at the international level for not having closed their eastern airspace in 2014, since if they had done so, this accident could have been avoided, knowing the high chances of something like this happening. But the truth is that in most war conflicts, the countries involved in the conflict rarely close their airspace. It is usually the airlines that decide not to fly over the area. There is one last event that is important to remember, and above all to report it. In 2021, something strange happened and that you probably remember. It is said that Belarus basically hijacked a Ryanair Boeing 737. But how did this happen? Well, the flight was originally scheduled from Athens to Vilnius. The Ryanair Boeing 737 departed with a local time of 7:29 a.m. on May 23rd. However, at around 9:26 a.m., an email was received at several airports from the terrorist group Hamas, supposedly stating that there was a bomb on board that plane and that if Israel did not cease hostilities in Gaza, they would detonate the device once they were near Vilnius, Lithuania. Here we have how things happened chronologically. At 9:30 a.m., 4 minutes after the email arrived, the Ryanair plane was informed by the Belarusian air traffic control that there is information that they are carrying an explosive device on board and that they recommend landing in Minsk, capital of Belarus. From the Ryanair plane, in order to know its veracity, they ask where these informations come from. They answer that an email from Hamas arrived at several airports giving this threat. Minutes later, the pilot is asked what his decision is. For this, the pilot asks what is the color of the code, green, yellow, amber or red, and he is told red. This being indicative of serious and imminent threat. And here is when the pilot decides not to continue toward Vilnius and maintain his position. 2 minutes later, they declare Mayday and inform ATC that they proceed to land in Minsk. This decision is communicated at 9:47, and 1 minute later, a Belarusian MiG-29 is alerted to prepare and depart, but it doesn't do so until 10:04. Meanwhile, the Ryanair was taking course towards Minsk, and during that time it was provided with information on how and where to land, to which the pilots ask if Ryanair has been informed of what happened, since from the plane they had no way to communicate with the airline, as they are told that in 5 minutes they will do it, and everything continues normally. It lands at 10-15 minutes, and the pilot keeps asking repeatedly if they have information about the airline, and the ATC keeps telling them no. Once everyone gets off the plane and proceeds to search for the explosive device, something totally unexpected happens. Roman Protasevich, a well-known journalist and activist against the Belarusian regime, is arrested. But from the West, this was painted from the first moment as a hijacking of the plane by Belarus, threatening with a MiG-29 loaded with missiles up to the top. However, when looking at the timeline left by the official ICAO document below, you can see that the MiG was informed to go out to intercept the plane after the Ryanair pilots decided to land in Minsk. I am not saying that it was not all a story created by Belarus. The emails with the bomb warnings were magically erased and there was only a record of them in screenshots, and Hamas never claimed responsibility for this. The truth is that it all sounds like it was planned by Belarus. However, at no time was Ryanair threatened with the MiG-29. It is also important to comment that on many occasions there are incursions into enemy airspace by fighters. This is quite frequent in the Baltic between NATO and Russian fighters. Or well, it was frequent when things were quieter. Today it will probably end very badly. One of the two sides decides to get into enemy airspace and enemy fighters come out to intercept them. It has happened very frequently and nothing ever happens. But on the other hand, it does also occur quite frequently between China and Taiwan, where the Chinese Air Force enters Taiwanese airspace, and it is said that it is likely that in the future China will enter more frequently to Taiwan airspace until Taiwan has to respond by shooting down some aircraft and use it as a pretext to start a conflict to justify an invasion by China. Thank you very much for watching this video and please subscribe to the channel. Whenever a commercial airplane is shot down, it's a very frightening scene. Unfortunately, there are many more cases than the ones we had talked in this video. But also the point was to mention that US and Russia, both of them, have done it. And here, there are not good ones or bad ones. There are only victims, and those are the ones who face the consequences.